QSO Today, episode 524, Pete Corp WA2JMG. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor, monthly or annually, by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. The following are QSO Today new and renewing listener sponsors: Larry Brown, W1LRY, Mike Rensman, 13R042, John Gruzel, KC9OJV, George Hulla, N8DTN, and William Gwaltney Jr., WA4GK. I want to thank the following listeners and readers of my blog for their donations in the last week: John Enders, KJ7KSX, $125. Martin Bluestein, K1FQL, $100. John DeMeco, KD7JR, $100. Jerry Kirschbaum, K0ES, $100. Dave Johnson, VE7VR, $50. Vern Jackson, WA0RCR, $30. Samuel Tonseth, KI7CDG, $10. Thomas White, 86TW, $10. And James Leonard, KA6KSN, $5. There was a great number of anonymous donations and sponsorships. I want to thank them for their support. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur callsign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio? Do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Breaking news is that I have multiple myeloma, a blood cancer. Despite its terrible pain at the beginning and an almost 1-year treatment process, the prognosis is positive that I will beat this thing too. With a positive attitude and the right pain medications, I look forward to a positive outcome. As I am not smart enough to cover it up, I'm sharing my lessons learned on my blog at qsotoday.com/blog. Charles Pete Corp, WA2JMG, operates simple rigs into wire antennas using low power. His primary operating mode is ragchewing on CW for meaningful and reliable communications. At the urging of his grandfather, Pete pursued the power system management side of the electrical engineering degree as a way to satisfy the market demand for power engineers in the industry when there is scarcity of supply. WA2JMG tells us his ham radio story beginning in 1960 in this QSO Today. WA2JMG, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Pete?
Yes, I am, Eric, 4Z1UG from WA2JMG.
Let's put some of the questions that people may be asking aside. Your name is Charles, according to your license. Where did Pete come from?
Well, I'll start out at the very beginning. I was brought up on a farm, a 80-acre farm.
Where?
Central New York, kind of just below the Adirondacks. And we had Jersey cows. We had 5 or 6 of them. We had truck gardens. We had all kinds of, we used to raise, my father and my father's mother and my mother's family are all from Ireland. And we raised potatoes, of course. And so we used to make a big thing out of even renting areas to plant potatoes and vegetables and all kinds of different things. Plus, we actually had to rent areas for hay. But anyway, that's how I was brought up. And my grandfather, his name was Seward Corp, and his middle name was, or he didn't have a middle name, but everyone called him Pete. Now, where that came from, I have no idea. But they called him Pete all the time he ever went anywheres. And for some reason, I was brought up by him more than I was my father. My father worked all the time, and he wasn't very. When his mother was 5 years old, she died, and I mean when he was 5 years old, she died, and my grandfather, his father, had to put him in an orphanage. That's what they did back then. And he stayed there until he was 14. So he had a lot of problems with people sometimes. And he was a good man, but he was distant. So I was brought up by my grandfather. And he was a great fisherman, hunter, farmer. So that's where I spent all my time. I wasn't interested in electronics, radio, or anything. And it took a long time. In fact, I think I used to tear cars apart and engines apart when I was in high school and race in the local tracks. And that was my thing, mechanics. I didn't want anything to do with electronics. My father did fool around with electricity. He wired the house and did a lot of things like that, but he was no electrician. So anyway, when I graduated from high school, I started going to a technical school for automotive. And about halfway through it, the instructor came to me and said, you're wasting your time here. You know more than I do about cars. Of course, this is at the very beginning. He said, you might better go into electronics or electricity. So I switched to electricity. And it was the same courses in the beginning, the first year. And then I had a problem. I had to go in and have a rhinoplastic nose operation. I had injured my nose. But when I got back, I went right to work. I didn't bother going back to school. I didn't like it. But I did have a little bit of an interest in electricity. And at the time, Korea was over. The war was supposedly over, but the guys in the school that I went to were all veterans, or most of them were veterans going to school on the VA bill. So they got me interested in it, and I joined the Marine Reserve, which was right there near the school. And I stayed in it for a year. I really didn't like the reserve. You had to go there once a week on weekends every so often. And so I decided to enlist. I enlisted in the Marines, never passed the physical. They passed me to get in the reserve, but they wouldn't pass me to get in the regulars. So I went to the Navy.
You were in the Marine Reserve. They didn't ask for the physical, but if you wanted to become active duty, then that would change your status, and then that's where they would require the physical.
No, I took a physical in the reserves. I passed it. But when I went to the regulars, it was a different physical, of course, and a different doctor, and and they were more strict, I'm sure. So I failed it. And I went to join the Navy, which is right there. And it's the same doctor, same deal. So anyway, one of them said to me as a kind of a joke, well, go on over to the Army. They'll take anybody. So I went over there. I wanted to go in, period. And they took me. No problem. I don't know. I'm sure the physical was different, the questions were different. And apparently, and the only problem was with the Marines, I had put on my history, and I had spastic colitis, which is a minor thing when I was in high school. And apparently, I know they said you have to go to your doctor and get a release and all this stuff. So I really didn't want to do that. So anyway, I went to the Army. They took me in. In 3 days, I was on my way to Fort Dix, New Jersey. Took my basic training, my infantry training. I was supposed to go to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, for a school for, I think it was truck repair. Of course, they tell you anything. And because the school was filled up, they sent me to Fort Devens, Massachusetts to join an infantry outfit. And when the school opened up again, I would be sent back down to Fort Belvoir. Well, then I got pulled out of the infantry group and sent to the Army Security Agency. And I'm sure a lot of it was, how you did on your tests. And they were looking for certain people, I guess. And, but I still had I did work with a guy when I went to the Marine Reserve that wanted to become a ham. I knew nothing about ham radio. He wanted to become a ham, and he interested me in sending back and forth with buzzers and a couple keys, which I don't remember what they were even. But so we did that for a while. But I probably only knew about half of the alphabet, and I really still wasn't interested. I really didn't get to even understand what CW was until I went in the Army Security Agency. And there, it's all around you. It's everywhere. That's what they did. They copied code, which was used for everything back then, sending messages, alerting people for direction finding. It was, really something. But I only was interested in it because that's what I had to use in my military occupational specialty, my job. So I still didn't get the bug. So until I went to Korea. When I went to Korea, it was there. It was everywhere. We had to use it. We had to learn it a lot better. I had to know code to get into the group, but not to do any real high-speed copying or sending or anything. We had operators they called 058, Diddy Boppers. And some of the guys today still call themselves that. And they could copy anywhere from 30, 40, 50 words per minute. And some of the operators, especially the Russian operators, were really fast and good. And I got this information from the operators. I didn't understand, that well what was going on.
These operators that were able to receive at 30, 40, 50 words a minute, were they also sending at that rate? And were they sending from a straight key?
No. These guys, these 058, they call them, that was their military occupational specialty. They basically just received and typed it on a mill. And that information was given to guys like me, analysts or special identification people. And we would, you did this, that was my second MOS. You try to break down the pages and pages of messages and determine who sent it, how it was sent, and so forth. And a lot of this, of course, had to be given to linguists. And we had trained linguists from Monterey, California. That's where they did all their language teaching. And those guys would go to school for a year. And we had also Korean military that helped us too, but I don't quite know how they were integrated. Everything was in the Army Security Agency. Everything was on a need-to-know basis. You knew your job. You weren't supposed to know what other people were doing. Now, once I got through to I was only there about 6 months, and I became a Spec 5. I was a Specialist 4. No, I became a Specialist 4 first, which is like a corporal. And then 6 months later, I was promoted to Spec 5. And when you get up to that point, you get involved with direction finding, with Morse operator techniques, and a few other things.
Did you actually have to go to Korea to actually do this job, or could you do this job stateside?
You could do this, but we had to take pictures. The main job, the last MOS I had was special identification techniques. And what we did was we took pictures of the code. When you send a DIT, it's a baud. It's a, if you look at it on a oscilloscope, it's an actual baud. And a DA is longer, and of course, and a DIT's shorter. And these bauds, if you take them on a high-speed camera, which is what we had, 8 millimeter or 16 millimeter, I don't remember, but it was a tape that went extremely fast, and it looked at a picture on an oscilloscope. And what I would get would be a 8.5 by 11 page with one baud on it, a DIT or a DA, and each baud would have characteristics in it that it wouldn't be just a straight rectangle. It would be, at the beginning, it would be all chopped up, different DITs in it.
It would detect the ringing of the transmitter as it was coming up, right?
Yes, each transmitter would not transmit exactly what a DIT was. It would be distorted depending on different things in the transmitter. So we could actually take that, and we used a baudette code. It was numbered, and it was designed just for operators like me. And we had to know this. We were taught this, NSA and Fort Meade, Maryland, when we were going to school there. We had to memorize all that. And so once we got over there and we took the pictures, we had to classify them. And if I got a couple of bauds from a transmitter, I would put these numbers down depending on what I saw. And then each transmitter would have a group of numbers. So you could look at a particular call sign, and it would say this is this call sign, this transmitter, and we would look at numbers that would come close to that, and then we would say, hey, this call sign over here looks like the same transmitter. That's how we would...
Like you're fingerprinting the transmitter.
Yes, exactly. And then we'd send it to the direction finding group, and we'd work with them, and they would take pictures of these different call signs, and if they come out the same, then all that information was sent to National Security Agency and Japan. We had a unit, our main unit was in Japan. So that's how we tracked when these guys, these armies, these even as low as companies, move back and forth in Korea. That's how we knew where they were going and when they were going.
You wrote to me that your brother became a ham radio operator before you did.
Yeah.
And that you actually extended your service so that you could take care of your brother while he was in the theater.
Yep. My mother sent me a letter. I very seldom got letters over there. There was no cell phones, there was a telephone, but you had to stand in line for hours to get to use it. So I just never, I think I tried to call once, never got through. So I would get a letter every so often. My mother sent me this letter and asked me to take care of my baby brother. He was coming over there. She was all worried. She only had 2 boys and a girl. And both of us would be in Korea. And she didn't like that at all, of course. And she just didn't realize, Korea is a big country. And who knows where you're going to be, right? But I went to the company commander and I explained to him, I only had a month before I was leaving, and explained to him what was going on. And he said, well, I think you're nuts, but if you want to stay, I said, 3 months, that's all. And our company was up at the DMZ. We were moved way back to Seoul for some reason. I don't know what the reasoning was, but so we were quite a ways back in the middle of everything. So felt I'll try to find him when he gets over here, but I have no idea whether I could. So in the meantime, he was a major. He transferred me it was still in the Army Security Agency, but was courier duty. We had to take out like one-time pads, cryptological documents to the detachments, because when you the guys that actually operate to send messages back and forth, you change your call every day, sometimes every 8 hours, once a month. It depends on the security, and you use these one-time pads. I'm sure you know what those are.
Sure. So
they're unbreakable.
If you read Ludlum or you read any of the spy books, you learn about one-time pads.
Yeah, well, that's what was done. So all I did was take these documents, which we were not supposed to know what was in there, of course, and we would take them up to these different detachments. And we had to fly up there. And, well, sometimes we could drive, but most of the time we had to fly. And we flew these, I didn't fly, but we had a pilot, of course, and he would fly us into these little postage stamp fields next to the detachment and deliver our documents. And sometimes we'd take documents back, but I could never know what was in them. It was all done. I was handcuffed to the briefcase and so forth. But it was interesting. But it allowed me to go almost everywhere in that area. So when my brother finally got there, I think my mother must have given him, I don't remember exactly how it worked, but he got a hold of me, told me where he was. And after a week or so, I got down there and we got together. So, and in the meantime, I didn't know all this. I had no idea what was going on. He was back home. I had been in service for 2 years.
Did you know that he'd become a ham radio operator?
No, not until I met him in Korea. And the reason I found out, he was in the Signal Corps, but he was assigned to a Mars outfit, the best duty you can get. And there was a Mars building, and they did use teletype to go back and forth. He was actually a teletype operator in the Signal Corps. And they used that to send messages back and forth. Plus they had voice transmissions once in a while. And of course he knew CW because he had gotten his license when he was in, I think it was some Signal Corps training in Georgia, someplace, I think he told me. And so when I got there, he tells me he's a ham. His call was K2POF, which he still uses today as a club call. I had no idea what all this was. But the more I talked to him, I found out what he was doing. And that kind of put a bug in me. because I'm around CW all the time. And so I did begin to study it more and actually got my speed up. And at the same time, I would get into the direction finding with those guys. We sent messages back and forth, and I would become one of the operators and help them out during these times. Now we only sent at 10 to 15 words a minute. They're slow speed operators, and that's how we had to do it. And you couldn't go over that. In fact, we had one guy that used a bug, and they kept telling him not to do it. And one day I went into the operating section, and the bug was there, but he wasn't. And I asked everybody where he was. He was a nice guy, a wise guy. And he was a ham. I have no idea what his call was. I didn't even know back then. And anyway, he disappeared. And somebody said he's probably in an infantry outfit someplace.
Because he wasn't following the rules, huh?
They weren't supposed to use high speed, bugs, or they weren't supposed to go over a certain speed, because the lowest you could only send at the lowest speed operator could understand, right? That's the way it was. So I never got much above. I don't think I could have passed a general really back then until I got home. And then my brother come home, and he's the one that sparked me into actually getting my license. That was in 1960.
And now this mid-show break. The QSO Today project that now includes 500 episodes of the QSO Today podcast, the curation of hundreds of hours of QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo presentations for public consumption, is now supported completely by you, the listeners. I am using a business model called Value for Value, a concept developed by Adam Curry, K5ACC, where you contribute to QSO Today exactly what you think its value is to you. Value for Value. This mid-show break and the promotion of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast later in the show are the only commercials that interrupt the program. QSO Today has no commercial sponsors to influence the content, direction, and editorial content of the QSO Today project, which exists solely for the promotion of the amateur radio hobby. Those of you that have listened to over 500 podcast episodes know that I'm not only infatuated by the amateur radio hobby, but by the people who perpetuate it as well. The hours that I dedicate to QSO Today is a half-time job. Your support at any level pays for all of the technology that I use to create, produce, host, and deliver the QSO Today podcast and the project to the ham radio community. And while it is a labor of love, it costs money. I know from statistics and surveys that only 6% of you actually contribute to QSO Today in some form. Please make a generous donation using the slider to set the amount of your donation. Make that donation monthly to ensure that QSO Today is here for the next 500 episodes. As a value-for-value donation, it should be in the amount that you value each episode of QSO Today, or your access to our amazing catalog of ham radio educational videos found on YouTube, Vimeo, and using our own player link in the show notes page. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually. Use my Amazon link in the right column of the QSO Today website before shopping on Amazon. Promote QSO Today to your friends and family by forwarding our email and social media posts. Subscribe to our mailing lists. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Tell your friends. All of these actions are value for value. Keep the QSO Today project alive by taking action now. We return to our QSO Today. So your first license was in 1960. How old were you?
21 or 2, I think.
And do you remember your first call sign?
Yeah, WA2JMG.
Which is what you have now.
Yep. But I went through when the extras come out. I think it was in 1977, somewhere around then. You get a special call, right? A vanity call.
1x2 call or something like that.
Yep. So I got K2PC, Pete Corp. Never liked it. Never liked it.
You never liked it for CW?
Yeah, for CW. I just didn't care for it. So, of course, WA2JMG is probably the worst call you could get and send because it's so slow. I mean, it takes so long. Today, when I try to break into expeditions, by the time I get through sending my call with a straight key, the guys probably worked three stations because everybody has a 3-letter call now or a 4-letter call, you know. So anyway, I got transferred right after that. I got my call in 77, I think. In 80, I got transferred down to Texas. And back then, if you were in a certain area, you had to get that call.
When you exited the military in 1960, you had this call sign. What did you pursue as a career once you exited the military? And did either mechanics or electronics now, did that influence the decision in terms of where you went for your new career?
No. My grandfather was still alive, working alone. He did carpenter work, roofing, and painting. And when I got out, of course, I didn't have a job. I went to work with him. He couldn't pay me very much, but I got a living wage. And I worked for him for about a year, I think. And one of the guys I knew from around that area in Mechanicville, New York, stopped and asked me. He said, "Hey, they're looking for guys in the local paper mill, especially guys that have electrical experience." And I really didn't have much electrical experience, but you couldn't tell anybody what you did. When in the Army Security Agency, you weren't supposed to tell anybody anything. So all I ever said was, "Oh, we worked on generators." And I did work on generators too. That was one of the things we did, just to help. Anyway, I went down there, was interviewed by, and I remember this guy's name, Ed Smoot, Smoot. I'll never forget that guy. And he was the foreman. And he said, "Yeah, we can hire you." So they put me, it was a small paper mill. They put me in the apprenticeship program. And I went through 5 years apprenticeship and became an electrician. And I've done that all my life. For 50 or more years, I've been nothing but an electrician. And became foreman, which I'd rather work with my hands. I always wanted to do work. And I didn't really like being a foreman. But every time I went to apply for a job, that's where I wound up. I studied, went to school at night, I had a diploma as a machinist. I could do all kinds of machine work, air conditioning, refrigeration, several other carpentry. So in the meantime, electricity was the big thing. And I was fairly good at it. I worked on high voltage stuff, which I didn't mind doing, but other people were scared of it.
Because a mill or a paper factory, the substation would actually be in the factory, right?
Yes, 117,000 volts to 34,000, then 4160, then 440, some nice 550. It was nothing. I loved it. In the meantime, I did this just about everything. And when I worked in a cement company and the electrical engineer retired, it's hard to get people to work in the cement industry because it's so dirty. And I was already there as an electrician, the foreman, and they promoted me to electrical engineer. So I actually had the title of electrical engineer for 3 or 4 years there until I went to, in fact, I think that's after when I went to Texas. I went to Texas as a foreman. And of course, I got my call, KZ5P there, which I liked. Then I come back up to New York 5 years later, and because I'm in New York, I got a 5 call. I didn't have to change it. I could have kept it back then. They changed the laws there. But I just didn't like being asked, where am I with a 5 call. So I picked up the call K2ARM, which is really nice on CW. It's a nice call. I used that call for a number of years. But when COVID come around, I did a lot of thinking about, I worked a couple guys that I had worked before years ago up here in this area. And they had WB2 and WA2 calls. And I remember them. I even looked them up in my logs. So I decided I'm going to go back to my original call, which I did. That was only in 2020.
That was a good idea because it also, people remember you from the early days.
Yeah. Yep.
When you got your license in 1960, what was the first rig that you had?
Homemade. I worked with a guy in the paper mill where I worked that was a big constructor. He loved to put things together. He gave me a bunch of parts, gave me one of the handbooks, I think, and I built a crystal-controlled 40-meter transmitter. And I had an old, I think it was an S38 or something, one of the first helicopter receivers there they made. I used that and got on the air with that.
And, of course, CW's straight key.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Did you like working DX? Did you like rag chewing? What was your favorite activity?
Rag chewing, even back then. I don't think I ever worked DX until my brother was a big DXer. He used 40 meters and 20 meters all the time and always talked to me about it, bragged about it. When I first got my license, I was a technician. Then I got my general, and then I didn't do anymore. I wasn't interested in anything else. And he kept saying, well, you got to go on 20 meters and 40 meters. I only went on 80 meters. 80 meters had the same sounds that I got in Korea. Our outfit monitored 2,000 to 4,000 megahertz normally. Other outfits monitored above that, or maybe even below that. But we had a general range because we put up antennas. That was the area that we worked in. And I think most of the military, the Chinese, North Korean military, were in that area. It was like in what they call NVIS today. And they were low, and they used hand crank generators over there, low antennas. So that was the best frequencies. So I was so used to hearing the static and the crashes and the things that we listened to over there that I started on using 80 meters, and I just felt at home.
Right, but 80 meters is kind of a nighttime band, isn't it? Or would you use it during the day?
Oh, yeah. Oh, you can use it in the daytime, but it's mostly night.
Are you back on the family farm? Is that where you're living now?
No, we're about 20 miles north of where we were.
You said in your message to me that you don't have trees around you.
We did. We had trees here, and this is a mobile home park, and it's a retirement area. It was put in 1972, and there weren't very many trees here. They started putting trees in everywhere. Well, the trees are 100 foot tall now, some of them, huge trees. And because of all the problems they've had in Florida and other places with trees coming down. And they've had a few here too. Yep. So they started cutting them down. And we had some huge trees here. When I had antennas, wire antennas going everywhere. Now I have one tree left, a maple tree. That's it.
My father passed away in May, and he was living in one of these mobile home parks. You know, double, triple wide. They look like regular houses, surrounded by trees. But they did not allow any kind of visible antenna. Do you stealthily build your antennas so that they're not noticeable by the neighbors?
Yes.
Or is there no limitations?
No, there's limitations. When I first moved here, we've been here in this park for 38 years because it's like a gated park. There's no gate, but there's guards, and there's just one entrance.
It's a older people's park, or it's mixed families?
It used to be, but now they have to, it's for anybody, but it's mostly retired. And when I first moved here, I went to the owner and asked him if I could put up antennas, and he didn't know anything about it. He asked me what I did, and I told him, and I had just been up from Texas, and I don't know if he felt sorry for us or what, but he said, well, you can put antennas up as long as nobody complains. So I put up a couple dipoles, and nobody complained. And that's one of the reasons I only run 40 watts. I found out the hard way that if you ran, in my case, if I ran over 40, I sometimes would begin to get into people's TVs and radios and all kinds of things. So at 40 watts, I have never had a complaint in 38 years here. And I've had all kinds of antennas. I had 3 or 4 double, what do they call them, end-fed ZEPs for 6 meters, 17 meters, all kinds of antennas. Never had a problem. Of course, now I don't have any trees, so I have a vertical. And I still don't have any problems with anybody. Nobody complains. No, I haven't had any trouble. We're gated in. I mean, we have a fence all the way around us.
You describe an antenna, I think on your QRZ page, that you actually built a 4-to-1 balun for.
Yes, I have what I call the cobweb.
Right.
All that is, it's a 4-to-1 balun that I made. Now, and that's not a balun, it's a unin, or whatever, UN, but I call it a balun. You wire it the same as a balun, but it's how you hook it up that makes the difference. And I have that in the ground. I go up to about 14 feet, 15 feet. Then I go up to the TV mast that we have our TV antenna on. We have over-the-air TV. We don't use the internet for that.
Cable TV.
Right. We don't use that. In the meantime, it goes up about 20 feet, and then it goes back to another pole that we have a birdhouse on, and then another one. It goes about 4 different directions. And when I looked at it, I thought to myself, that's just like we have spiders everywhere, of course. I said, that's a cobweb antenna. And so that's what I call it. It's only 45 foot or 44 foot long, and it works. I've worked guys out in Arizona, mostly POTA and SOTA guys.
So it's on the air and parks on the air, guys. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And they use 10 watts. So, or most of them do. And I've worked a couple of them out there with that antenna. But I still didn't, it's just not what I would call a real antenna because it has in so many different directions. So I put up, I actually had a 41 foot and vertical, which it went up. I think it went up 31 foot with aluminum, and then I had to put a 10-foot piece of wire to a tree when I had a tree. So it wound up 41 foot. And that worked great.
That's like a random vertical that you use with a
random wire, yeah.
With an antenna tuner at the bottom.
No, I used the 41. I used the 4-to-1 balance. The reason it worked so good, I didn't use radials. I put 3 4-foot ground rods in, and that was it. So it worked. The 4-to-1 balance worked against the 3 ground rods and the 41-foot wire. And the standing wave was, I think, on 20 and 30, it was over 3 or 4-to-1, but it still worked. That's not too bad. The rest of the bands, the standing wave was within 2 or 3 or less, so it wasn't bad. Now, then when the wire broke, I wound up just trying it with 31 foot, and that worked all right. So then, of course, I take it down every couple of years it's a bunch of old Yagi antennas slipped together and screwed in with sheet metal screws. So when I took it down once, and taking it down, it fell and broke. And so I wound up with 26 foot. And that's what I got now. And it works just as good. In fact, the standing wave on all the bands is less than 2.5-to-1. And I also put radios in. So you can't beat it. The balance makes the difference.
So you operate only CW, and you make mention that that's the only digital mode that you operate. But what kind of rigs are you operating? Because it seems to me that some of the rigs that you mention actually have quite a lot of capability, including spectral display. Could you talk about what rigs you're operating now?
Yep. The only thing, I have a FT 991A Yaesu, and the only bands I use it for is 2 meters and 6 meters. I don't use it on low frequency.
For CW?
Right. Oh, it's CW. Oh, every morning, well, this morning, of course, I didn't, but every morning between 8 and 9, there's a bunch of guys that get on, most of them in Connecticut, on 2 meters at 144.205. But in my case, and the CW guys, we go down to 145.195, and we operate, we work each other. CW. Every once in a while, somebody will chime in on phone, but it used to be 8 or 10 of us that worked CW, but we used to call it the over 80 net because we were all over 80 years old, and most of them have died off. I'm the second oldest. The oldest is 95. I haven't been able to work him. He's in Ohio, but he works a lot of the guys.
And you're using wire antennas for 2 meters.
I'm using a wire 2-element Yagi. It's still made out of wire.
Right, but are you turning it, or is it just pointing in one direction?
No, I leave it. I leave it pointed south. It's so broad that it picks up enough guys. I'm not to worry. And I have the next guy is. Oh, wait a minute. I'm the third. There's one 95. There's one that's 90, or will be 90. I'm 87. There's another one's 82, another one 81, and then we go down to the young guys. I think he's 70. I think there's a couple 70s.
And now this mid-show break. Every 2 weeks, I listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Vince, VE6LK, Mark, N6MTS, Thomas, K4SWL, Michael, VA3MW, and Rod, VA3ON, and their guest on often topical and important projects in amateur radio. This discussion amongst the regulars and their guests remind me of the conversations that I used to listen to on 146.94 and 146.46 megahertz in Orange County, California, while working on my own workbench almost 50 years ago. It is amazing how much practical ham radio knowledge that we can absorb by listening to the Workbench podcast that starts to make sense when we start our own deep dive into our own projects. So join me by listening to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast now and as George and crew push beyond 200 episodes. You can get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. And now, back to our QSO. What do you use now on 80 meters?
Well, I use the vertical on 80, but I can't operate 80.
Do you use the 991?
No. My high frequency stuff, I use the IC, the ICOM 718. I've used that for years. It's 20 years old, I think. And it's a simple rig. It's easy to use. It only has one CW filter, but it works. I work everybody with it, and I run it at 40 watts.
And what's the noise floor like in your park?
It's a little high, and this is what I like about the ICOM. It has a noise blanker that's absolutely great. I mean, I put that, in fact, with the vertical, I have to use that most of the time. Now, with the Cobweb, I don't have any noise. It's mostly horizontal. I just don't need to use it. It's quiet, but it's not as good an antenna.
Do you belong to any amateur radio clubs?
I used to get a lot of information from the Warren County. I think it's W2 WAC or WRC. It's Warren County. We're in Saratoga County, but it's 5 miles away, and I know a lot of the guys there.
You're not active with the club?
I'm not active with it, no. They do have a lot of outings, and I always try to operate with the guys on CW. And there's a couple guys. One guy was in the Army Security Agency. He was what they call a diddy bopper, and but he's a lot younger than me. But he knows what I went through. So, and he's on CW all the time, and he's mobile all the time. So I work him a lot. No, he's an N2. I don't remember his call now, but he's a great guy.
Do you think that amateur radio, at least for guys your age and younger, do you think it's a fine hobby for older people? And would you encourage even older people to join the hobby now? Absolutely. I think it's great. I think it's the best thing you can have. It's a way of communicating. I don't like the digital mode simply because there's all kinds of jokes around there about, the digital operator sitting there asleep, but still working all over the world. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm assuming it is. But, and voice, a lot of the guys in the POTA and SOTA, they operate voice, and they do great. I've never tried it. One of my friends that he was a veteran, but he wasn't in the Army Security Agency. But I work him in the morning on 2 meters. He's in Hancock, Massachusetts, WA1RKS Ellis, and he works voice a lot.
and he can work these guys left and right much faster than I can. But I have no problem at all working these guys. I have a G106, Zygo G106, which cost me $225, I think. It's a great little rig. It works. Of course, with my vision, my problem is my vision. It's a very small screen, and I have magnifying glasses that I used to use it, but it works great. And then I have a X6100 Zygo, and that's a great rig. It has great antenna tuner, everything. So, and I use those with my vertical or the cobweb antenna, and they work. I sometimes work guys better, I think, with the QRP rigs than I do with the 40-watt 718.
Do you think that's because they have the internal antenna tuner in them?
It could be. The ICOM, I have an antenna tuner. It's a AT200 Kenwood. It's an old one, manual, but it works fine. But the Zygo is really nice. It's quick. I can go up and down the band. And the nice thing about that vertical antenna is, and the cobweb, I can go from 80 meters to 10 meters in seconds. When I had the dipoles up everywhere, I had to keep switching coax, but it's much better now with these.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now? Is it the same thing that excited you in 1960, or have you found some new things that really light your fire in ham radio?
The only thing I can see that's better, there's more guys getting on CW. Whether they stay on CW or not, I don't know. But it seems like a few years ago, when I just happened to stumble on the Parks on the Air, and there weren't that many guys out there. You kind of look for them. I don't look at the site as much as I just go back and forth from 40 meters, 70, 60 something, right up through. And I hear them on here and I work them. And then I have to go to the site to get the actual, where it is. But because they don't always give their park number. But regardless, today, if you want to look for them, there's pages and pages of these guys. They're all over the place on CW, which is nice.
Things like CW Academy and the Long Island CW Club, these groups have done an amazing job promoting CW to ham radio. I'm finding a lot of the people I interview, a lot of young people who I haven't interviewed yet, are finding CW as a fascinating mode for them to operate. And it's quite portable if you're like a backpacker.
Yeah. Well, I used to take my QRP rigs and go out on the deck. We have a big deck in the summertime and just throw a wire out into a tree and operate just to rag chew. That was great too. And I used mostly 40 meters for some reason. That seemed to be the best band.
Do you have advice that you'd give to newer returning hams to the hobby, Pete? They're like Rip Van Winkle. They've been asleep for 20 years, and all of a sudden they're coming back to ham radio, or they're new. Is there some advice that you would give them?
Of course, I would tell them to stay with CW and concentrate on rag chewing, because that's the part that interests me. My brother is a numbers guy. He wants to work stations, hundreds and hundreds of stations. He doesn't. In fact, I tried to get him to come on 2 meters so we could rag chew because he's only 30 miles away, but he just won't do it. And when I talk to him, I do get him on CW once in a while. He does like CW, but he works 599, your grid or your state, and then goodbye. And I personally, I do it, but I'm not happy with it. I like to get somebody. In fact, when I go on, when I work a guy on POTA or SOTA, I always add a few things in here. Some of them don't like that. Some of them like it, and they'll come back and we'll talk a little bit, chat a little bit. And same way on 2 meters. These guys, I call them grid chasers. All they want to do is get your grid. But I always have one or two. In fact, there's one W1VD, Jay. He's in Connecticut. He's about 150 miles away. We talk for 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes even on CW on 2 meters in the mornings. Pass information about the weather, different things. That's, to me, that's CW. And that's what I prefer. And I don't see it as much as I did. But that Long Island CW club, I do work guys that have been in that, and they seemed a lot better. They seemed to be more at ease using rag chewing than most of the other guys.
It could be societal. We're so used now to passing information between us, as short text or emails or something like that, that the art of conversation seems to be lacking on all fronts, that people are not used to listening to each other and having a dialogue. And so I think maybe the key to becoming a good rag chewer, or maybe even the key to becoming, if you're already a rag chewer, to becoming a conversationalist, might be complementary with CW rag chewing and having conversations with people face to face. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's right. Exactly.
Or maybe people think they're prying when they ask you questions. They think you're trying to learn too much about them.
That's true. But also I noticed that the guys that don't want to carry on anything, especially on some of the DXers even. I've worked DXpeditions, and I've always thrown in a little extra. Of course, some of the people around them get upset, but sometimes they'll carry it on. They'll ask me, well, how are you? What have you been doing? And a few other things that is nice. And I think it's getting better. I don't think it's getting worse.
It humanizes the exchange.
Yes.
So you don't feel like you're talking to a computer that's automatically generating the reply, although you could be.
That's the other thing that kind of, for a while, I got away from DXpeditions because you could tell they're using computer-generated CW. They're probably, in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if some of them were letting it copy the CW. And, of course, when you send with a straight key, your CW isn't always picked up by the computer, which is nice.
So maybe the CW sending programs need to have a fist control to give it a unique sound like you'd have if you were sending straight key.
But in Korea, they were just coming out with Morse operator. It wasn't techniques. We were special identification techniques, but I was involved in helping them get the Morse operator. It wasn't techniques, but it was some other name. But basically, they were working on back then a computer or some software or something. And they had computers, but they were huge computers and 18-wheelers. But they were looking at operator characteristics because our operators would write down. Sometimes they would type in there, hey, this guy has a funny way of sending his F or something. And they would put that in there, and they were told to do that, and they did. And it was some of the operators were absolutely fantastic. Our operators, they would say, hey, this guy, I can tell this is the same guy that was over here. And we'd have to put that in there. Now, don't forget, all this information went back to NSA. And I'm sure they looked at all that, and that's how they identified operators and call signs, because some were like regiment calling battalion and battalion calling company, and some of them were the same guys, same operators. So that was a big thing back then, but it was just beginning. I only got into the tip of it to help out a little bit, but being that I wasn't a real CW operator, I couldn't copy like they could. I never went any further, but I'm sure they did a lot more with it. And I'm sure it's like that today. I can tell when some of the operators come on 2 meters, there's a couple of them that use straight keys. I know who they are when they come on. Exactly. A lot of it is them.
They have a fist ID.
Yes.
Like their fingerprint.
Yep.
Pete, it was wonderful to have this conversation. I know we went back and forth a little bit on what we would talk about, but I knew we'd have an hour's worth of time, an hour's worth of stuff to talk about, and I wanted to thank you for coming on the QSO Today podcast and wish you 73.
Well, 73s. Thank you very much.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Pete. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in WA2JMG in the search box at the top of the page. Previous episodes by clicking on the transcription button on every show notes page. The cost is $75 per episode, regardless of the length. We will quickly transcribe the episode and give you credit for your sponsorship. Please send us the call sign of the podcast to make sure that we transcribe what you want. Remember that QSO Today is value for value. Please support our project by making a donation or becoming a listener sponsor today. Use our Amazon link before shopping at Amazon, as we receive a small commission on your Amazon purchases. Subscribe to our mailing lists, both my blog and the podcast, and forward the messages to friends and family who would enjoy QSO Today content. Promote us on social media and give us a 5-star rating and reviews whenever you are asked. QSO Today is available on every podcast player and venue, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, and Podcasting 2.0. Get a Podcasting 2.0 player to make it easy to get your next episode as soon as we publish. My thanks to Ben Bresky, who, as the consummate artist, makes this host and his guests always sound brilliant. Ben also publishes a weekly Jewish history podcast. There is a link to that on the QSO Today homepage. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.